Here we go. Okay, the Ezra is today's daf is daf Chav Vav. We're starting unusually, but in order to have the flow, we're going to start from the Mishnah on daf Chav Hey, Amud Beis on top. So we're going to make it bigger over here, and let's make it straight. Okay, so here we are. The Mishnah is discussing over here. You make a neder. Some neders you don't even have to go to the rabbi to matter the neder, because it's understood it's not a neder in the first place. So the Mishnah is discussing another example of such a neder. Nidre shagagos, a neder that's made in error. Let's say you said my bread should be asur as a carbon. Im ochalti v'im shasisi. If I ate or drank today. Okay, you really, when you say that statement, okay. Hi. When you say that statement, and you make a neder, when you make that statement, when you make a neder, do you really want to make a neder? No, you really believe that you didn't eat and you didn't drink. So you're just saying, I take a neder that my bread should be asur if I ate and drank today. But your intention is not to take a neder.
So why did you make a neder?
Why did he make it? Because he wants to convince somebody else. He wants to convince somebody else that du nicht gegessen hat. So he says that in Belusha Neder, if I ate today or drank today, my bread should be asur. But he just wants to convince somebody. And the niskash ochel v'shasur. But then he remembered that he ate and drank. So then it's not a neder. This is nishkan neder. Because his intention is not to take a neder. Let's say he says in the future, Sha'ani oichel v'sha'ani soisha. This is another case. Case number 2 is he says, I make a neder on condition that I eat and drink today. In other words, I make a neder that my bread should be asur. This loaf of bread should be asur to me if I eat or drink today. Yeah, right. Well, that's true. But when he was mekayim the t'nai, the shachach, he forgot the ochel the shasa, and he drank. So when he ate and drank, he didn't realize that by eating and drinking, he's making a neder upon himself.
Yeah,
this is nishkan neder, because you have to be fully. Yeah, your brain has to be fully aware that you're making the neder. When the neder is chal, your brain has to be fully aware. Another case, a guy is angry at his wife, and he says to his wife, my wife cannot have any hanoah for my belongings. He says, my wife has no reshus on my belongings. Why? Shadvan ve'eskisi, because he's convinced that his wife made a geneva on his wallet. Or he's convinced that this is his stepwife gave a patch to his son. So he says, I believe because you did these things, you're also to have any hanoah from my belongings. So he really wants to make a neder. If you ask him, he really wants to make a neder. And he's saying, because I'm so convinced that you stole my wallet and you gave a patch to my son. And then he finds out, somebody tells him you made a mistake. She never smacked the son, she never stole. So then all these 3 cases are not a neder. It's not a neder, it's a neder shgaga, a neder that's made a mistake. And you don't even have to go to the rabbi to be matter the neder. Now look what the Mishnah says. You see people that are by your fig tree. A bunch of people are surrounding by your fig tree and helping themselves, So the Omar, and you said, Hare aleichem carbon. The fig tree is like also to hegdish tayu. You're not going to take it. Not because of Geneva. Your person can make, if it belongs to you, you can asur it on somebody else with a neder. So that if he takes it, the other person takes it, he gets an aveira. So he said, Hare aleichem carbon. My fig tree should be asur to you as a carbon. But what happened? The nimtzu, amongst the crowd that was taking from the fig tree, was Oviv, his father, V'ochiv, his brother, And of course, he never meant them. But there were other people as well. So he wanted to exclude his father. But yet, when he said the neder, he didn't know that his father and brother are in the crowd. So later on, he says, no, my father and mother and brother are not included into the neder. So Beis Shammai says, makes sense. Hey, Mitorah, the father and brother could take from the fig tree. Uma she'imahem asurim. And the other people that are in the crowd, they can't take the fig tree. Beis Hillel and Beis Hillel says, Elu ve'elu mutarim. Both the father and the brother and the other crowds could continue to eat from the fig tree. Why? Because since the neder already is broken, because you're saying, oh, my father and brother are not included in this neder, so we have a rule, neder that's broken, it's broken, neder shehuter miktsasai huter kulai. If part of the neder gets broken, it's the whole thing breaks. It's almost like a car window. When you give a crack to the car window, all of a sudden the whole window starts cracking up. So same thing, Beis Hillel said, since you already put a crack in this neder, by saying, oh, the father and brother are not included in the neder, so therefore, nobody's included in the neder. And we'll discuss this more in the Gemara. So Gemara says, Tana, we learned in a Brisa, Kishem shenidre shkagos mutarim, just like when you make a neder, and it's a mistake in neder, we learned in the Mishnah that's mutar, and you don't have to go to the rabbi to undo it because it's not a neder. Kach shvua shgagos mutaris. If you make a swear by mistake, mutaris, that's mutar. Now, what's a shvua shgagos? Simply, you could also set up the cases that you take a shvua that you're not going to eat bread. If you're not going to eat bread, if you ate and drank today, you could also make it up the same way, in the same examples as the Mishnah. But the Gemara says like this, what is called, give me a good example, an extreme example, that a shvua of mistake, and it doesn't have a din shvua. Even though you said, I swear, it doesn't mean anything. So the Gemara says, Kagoin, let's give you the example, Rav Kahana and Rav Asi. You have machlekes between Rav Kahana and Rav Asi. Hadain Omar, they had a machlekes, what their rabbi said, what Rav said. Rav Kahana and Rav Asi learned by their Rebbe, Rav. So Hadain Omar, one of them said, Shvu'asa, I swear that I'm not going to eat my loaf of bread, Dahaki Amar Rav, because I'm sure that Rav said this. Hadain Omar, and the other one said, Shvu'asa, I swear, Dahaki Amar Rav. This is what Rav said. So each one is swearing because they're convinced they heard from the Rebbe correctly. And they're swearing that if I didn't hear correctly, then my bread should be usher. So really, do they really not want to eat the bread? No, they want to eat the bread. They're so convinced that what they're saying is true that they take a shavua to convince you to believe them, to convince somebody else to believe them. But in their hearts, they don't want to take a shavua not to eat bread. The chol chad v'chad adaite the nafshe shape komishtaba. Each one is swearing, even though Rav couldn't have said both. Either Rav says one way or says the other way. And yet, each one is swearing because they're so convinced that they're saying correctly what Rav said. So if you're convinced, it's not that you want to asi yourself the bread. You just want to show to somebody else that what you're saying is true. So therefore, this type of shvur, if you turn out that you got it wrong, and if you turn out you got it wrong, so you should not allow to be eaten the bread, because you said, I swear that I will not eat this bread. If I say that this is what Rav said, and it turns out that Rav did not say that, still, you would still be allowed to eat the bread, because you didn't swear because you wanted to swear. You swore because you were convinced in your head that this is what Rav said. So therefore, it's not considered a shvua, and you can continue to eat the bread because it doesn't take effect.
So it was based on a false assumption, both.
So yeah, you could convince yourself into everything, and you're so sure of yourself that you take a shvua, I will not eat this bread if I'm wrong. And if you turn out to be wrong, still the shvua doesn't work. Because you
that to be right also, but it was a false assumption to begin with.
Pardon?
One of them was right.
One of them was right. So if the
But doesn't matter. It's not a shvua for both of them because it wasn't based on a correct assumption. Is that what you're saying?
yes, each one in their minds,
Yeah.
thinking that they're correct, and they don't want to take a shvua that I'm not going to eat the bread. But in order to convince the other guy, they swear that I swear that I will not eat this bread if I'm wrong. And if they turned out to be wrong, they still could eat the bread.
I think that he can say his family. I said I make a neder that my family would not have would need this. But say on French people, how can I make a neder for the French people? He is not entitled to be a neder for other people on the street. If I'm there, I don't belong to him.
Right. But if you own it, if you own the fig tree, if it's Danas, you can't machen a neder as jenes on the shulman anofening. In other words, if it's my fig tree, I could say, for everybody else, this fig tree is also in a neder, like a carbon. This kementin. Okay. So the Mishnah, back into the story of it. By the way, the pasuk in Chumash says, Adam b'shvua, which means that you have to be a mensch when you swear. That means you have to want to take it effect. You want it to take effect. So therefore, you have to be fully aware that the shvua is going to take effect. And if you're convinced it's not going to take effect, so then the shvua doesn't take effect, even if you said I swear. Now back into the Mishnah. The Mishnah said that if you see people eating from your fig tree and you say Harei Alechem carbon, so the Mishnah said that it's machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. If you could now say, oh, my father and brother are not included, what happens to the other people? Beis Shammai says the other people still remain aser, and Beis Hillel says elu ve'elu mutar, that once the nether is broken, so then everybody is permitted to take from the fig tree. So the Gemara says like this: Tanan Hasan, we learned it over there. In other words, a guy swore. Let's say he made a neder. He's not eating meat. He's not eating meat for a long time. I'm off meat. And then they come to him and say, listen, Shabbos and Yontiv, there's a mitzvah of einig. You can't deprive yourself from not eating meat on Shabbos and Yontiv. So they can open up the neder and say, did you really know how important it is to have meat on Shabbos and Yontiv? So they can say, yes. So then then they can undo that part of the neder. That means that he'll be usher during the weekdays, not eating meat. On Shabbos and Yontiv, he'd be permitted to eat meat. So B'Rishoina, in the beginning, they paskin like Beis Shammai. They used to say, those Shabbos and Yontiv, now that the rabbis told you how important it is to have meat on Shabbos and Yontiv, then you're mutter to have meat on Shabbos and Yontiv. But the rest of the days remain in effect, that you're not allowed to have meat during the rest of the days. That's how they would paskin, because in the beginning they used to paskin like Beis Shammai. Until Rabbi Akiva said, and Rabbi Akiva said, the liman, and he taught us like Beis Hillel, because apparently they forgot if Beis Hillel said or Beis Shammai said. So Rabbi Akiva said, establish the rule, it's like Beis Hillel. Neder shehutar miktzasai hutar kulai. Once you undid a neder, so then the whole thing becomes mutter. And therefore, since they matter you already for Shabbos and Yontiv, they matter you for the entire week. Now the neder falls away. So that's what it says. Now comes along Rabbah. And this is the point of the whole daf. Rabbah said, why would Beis Hillel say neder that part of it became mutter, the whole thing falls away? We find, let's say you have an agreement, like an insurance agreement. They always add addendums to the agreement. So just because you're adding an addendum, why should it break the whole agreement? In other words, you make a neder, now you're trying to explain the neder, I didn't mean to include my father and brother, so why does the whole agreement fall away? So Rabbah said, the Kuli Alma, everybody would agree, Beis Shammai Beis Hillel, that it doesn't fall apart. The neder remains in effect. Kol heichad Amar, whenever you say, you're just adding an addendum. Ilu hayisi hayadeya sha'aba beinechem hayisa oimer. If I knew my father was amongst them, I would have said the same neder. Now, this is very important. I would say the same neder. Kulchem asurim, everybody get away. Everybody should be usher on my fig tree. But I would have added right in the way, if I know my father was there, I would say chutz me abba, except for my father. So all you're saying is that I'm making an addendum to the previous neder. So Rabbah said, in that case, there is no machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. The kulin asurin ba'aviv mutter. Then it's very clear. Then everybody would be usher, and the father would be mutter because it's an addendum. But what happens once you found out that your father is there, right? If you find out that your father is there, you can say, I'm changing the whole language of the neder, because you're so embarrassed by even people thinking for a moment that you wanted to include your father in the neder by saying kulchem asurim. So what happens? The machlokes is lo nechlaku ela ba'omer. Beis Shammai Beis Hillel don't argue. Only in this case, you're saying like this: Ilu hayisu yadeya she'aba beinechem. If I knew my father was amongst this group, hayisu omer, I would have changed the language of the neder. And what would I have said? Not kulchem asurim like over here, kulchem asurim, right? I would not say that, but I would say I would have chosen better way to make the neder. I would say you're usher, you're usher, you're usher, you're usher, and then I would, not, and I would say my father is mutter, abba mutter. So now, in this case, you're not adding an addendum; you're changing the original document. On this, Beis Shammai says no. The original neder takes effect, and only the father's mutter. On this comes along Beis Hillel, and he says no. Since you're changing the language of the neder along with the addendum, so you're changing the original language, then everything becomes mutter. The whole neder falls apart, and therefore neder shut to mitzvah huter kulai. So that is Rabbah's opinion. So according to Rabbah, you need two things to do. In order for it to break apart a neder, you have to not only first add an addendum, but you're trying to change the original language of how you made the neder in the first place. So then you're showing the whole thing was a big mistake, and that's why it's mutter. We go to Chavav Amar Aleph.
If I further think is mitter or his neder, everything is mitter, so he can say too that he can swear, which is not true. He can swear that's mitter too, because the swear is not worth anything. So how about the swear? He's doing a mitzvah to swear. He's not allowed to swear at all.
No, but this is a mistake. He doesn't mean to do this on purpose. He sees people stealing from his fig tree, and mind they're strangers. So he wants to asa everybody on the fig tree. So er meint es ernst. But then he sees that the father and brother are there. So then that's what we're talking about over here. He does not have a dafkenik. The Rava says like this: the kuli alma. Rava is very lenient. He says it doesn't take even an addendum, according to Beis Hillel, to break apart a neder. The Rava disagrees with Rava. The kuli alma, everybody would agree. Kol hecha da amar, if you say, even Beis Shammai would agree that you could break apart the whole neder and everybody's mutter if you change the language. If you say, if I knew my father was amongst you, I would say, I would have changed the whole language of the original neder and said, so-and-so are usher, you are usher, and my father's mutter. So everybody would agree if you correct yourself and say that I would have changed the language of the neder, then the original neder, kula mutter. Even Beis Shammai would agree the whole neder falls apart and everybody is mutter. Loi nechlaku, they're only arguing ela ba'omer in this case. You're saying like this: Ilu hayisi yadeya she'aba beinechem hayisa omer kulchem asurim chutz ma'aba. You didn't change the language. You're saying now that if I knew my father was there, I would have kept the original language. I would have kept the original neder. I said kulchem asurim, everybody's asa, except my abba. So then I'm just going to add an addendum. So now look at this. This is that. So l'chayra, Beis Shammai seems to be correct because it's an addendum. So why would you break apart the whole neder? But if you look at his language, if he wants to change it into two parts, kulchem asurim is part number one, and everybody's answer, and then part number two is chutz mi abba, except for my father. So Beis Shammai Savrei law, Beis Shammai holds ki Rabbi Meir. like Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir elsewhere has an opinion that when a person says a statement, what is the most important part of the statement? The first part or the second part? Rabbi Meir says the oimet voice lashon rishon. You grab the first thing when it comes out of a person's mouth. Psychologically, he's prepared. He's more accurate on the first thing. He's more accurate on the first thing. And therefore, Rabbi Meir says the primacy of the whole thing is you look after what he said first. Kulchem asurim. Everybody's asur. So that, in effect, is saying that he wants a neder, everybody to be asur. So, of course, when he says, accept the father, so we'll say that the father is permitted, but kulchem asurim still remains in effect. That's what Rabbi Meir holds. You look at the first statement that comes out of his mouth. Now, where did Rabbi Meir say such a thing? I'm going to tell you that if a guy says, harezu on this animal, it should be an oila, and then he says, harezu shlamim. He says two contradictory things out of his mouth. Is it an oila, and then he says, harezu shlamim. Which do you look at? So we say, harezu oila. You look at the first statement that comes out of his mouth. Because Rabbi Meir says a person's more in his psyche, is more prepared to speak correctly when it first comes out of his mouth. So therefore, you grab a hold of what he said first. So that's why Beis Shammai is in agreement with Rabbi Meir. Beis Hillel holds Ki Rabbi Yossi, who goes according to Rabbi Yossi. The Amar, who said no, person's not so careful in the first part of his statement. The Amar Bigmar Devarav Odam Nitbas. You just look at the concluding a statement that you can hold a person accountable by the end of his words. And since over here, at the end of his words, if you give primacy to already what he's saying, there's no neder, because in the second part of a statement, he's saying there's no neder by my father. So once already the primacy of the statement is there is no neder, so the whole neder falls apart for everybody. And therefore, Beis Hillel holds that the neder broke apart, and therefore, and since it's permitted for the father, it's permitted for everybody else. So that's the two opinions. So let's just get it clear. And then we'll ask two questions, and that's the whole daf. The point over here is that Rabbah, and just to say it in one sentence, Rabbah said, the one that we're trying to explain over here is Beis Hillel. And the question is, why does Beis Hillel say the whole neder breaks apart? Why can't you say that the neder works for everybody else, not the father? So the answer is, Rabbah explained it, is that the reason is because it breaks apart if the man turns around and says, I'm not just making an addendum. I'm changing I would have liked to change the language how I spoke in the beginning. I said in the beginning that kulchem asurim, everybody's asur. I was so upset. And then he's saying, except my father. Now that I know that his father's there, he's saying that I would have changed the whole original language of the neder. I would have said, you should be asur, you should be asur. I would have singled out people. And then I wouldn't have singled out my father. So since he's taking back the original neder that he said out of his mouth, so that Beis Hillel holds neder that's broken on one end breaks apart the whole neder. Again, like the example with the car glass, you break a little crack, and all of a sudden the whole thing cracks apart. Yeah. Rava says no. Rava says even everybody would hold that breaks apart a neder. If you're changing the language, it certainly breaks apart a neder. But Rava holds Beis Hillel is even more lenient. Even if he kept the same language and he said kulchem asurim and he said chutz ma'aba, he's saying I would have said it this way, like I said it before, but I would have added the addendum. Beis Hillel holds, like Rabbi Yossi, that you always give primacy to the end statement. And since the end of a statement is a statement that there should be no neder to my father, so that overrides what he said in the earlier part of the statement, of that everybody's asur, and therefore the whole neder will fall apart. Again, if you said it all at one shot, yes, you could have a neder that applies for everybody, but not your father. But now that when you're coming to explain it, so you're explaining it an hour later, when you finally realize your father's there, then once you're breaking apart the neder, Beis Hillel holds everybody, it's broken for everybody. Next, so the Gemara asks a question. Esrei Rapapa l'Rava. Rapapa asked the questions for Rava. Ketzad Omer Rabbi Akiva, how did Rabbi Akiva say, neder shehuta miktsasa huta kulan? Rabbi Akiva and Beis Hillel are the same thing. Give me an example, the Mishnah says, of neder that became partly permitted, the whole thing falls apart. For example, the Mishnah gives you 3 examples. A guy says, I make a neder that all of you can't benefit from me, right? All of you can't benefit from me. And then, and one of them, he excluded one of them. Later on, he said, I didn't mean you. Hutra kulam. Then everybody's included. Let's say he said it this way. He says, you can't benefit from me, you can't benefit from me, and you can't benefit from me. And then all of them. And then he huta rishon. And then he goes to the rabbi and says, oh, I didn't mean him. I didn't realize it. One of them becomes mutter. Again, hutra kulam, all of them become aser. So notice the first 2 cases are cases where one becomes mutter, and then the whole thing falls apart. So nobody becomes mutter. But then the Mishnah says, when you said you said not this one, not this one, but huta achroin. You only the last person that you said not this one, and then you undid the neder to that last person. Only he's mutter. Achroin mutter v'kulan asurim. The neder is still in effect for everybody else except for the last person. So how do you explain this Mishnah? So the Gemara is going to say like this: Bishlam el Rabba. Rabba has an easy way to explain this Mishnah. The first 2 cases, Rabba holds that if you need 2 things to make a neder fall apart. 2 things. One, that you have to obviously make the addendum of I don't want him to be in the neder. And 2, you have to change. You said you were going to change the language of the neder. So in the 2 cases of case number 1, which I have labeled here, and case number 2, in all these cases, your intention is to change the language of the neder. So if one person becomes mutter, everybody becomes mutter. The first 2 cases, you change the language from kulchem, you're changing it to zeh. And the second case, which is actually zeh, you're changing it, I would have said kulchem. And some people have a preference, as the Ran explains, to say kulchem. And some people have a preference to say zeh. And so if you come back and say, I would have changed the way I said it in the first place, then once becomes mutter, everybody comes mutter. The seifa, but the last case number 3, where the neder still remains in effect, so then the amal kulchem, you kept the original statement of kulchem, and therefore it's kulchem. You're not changing your language, so you're just you're undoing the neder for one person. So therefore, the neder still remains in effect, but except for that last person because it's an addendum. So that explains the Mishnah according to Rabbah. But according to Rabbah, the first case number 1, where everybody falls apart, he doesn't hold that you need to change the language. As long as you add an addendum, the whole thing falls apart. So then the first case is talking about huta echem and huta kulam is because you add an addendum. I don't mean him. So then once the neder fell apart for one person, it falls apart for everybody else. So then what do I need the second case for? What's the second case for? You're going to tell me the second case for is he changed the language? Well, if the first case, if it's one becomes mutter, you don't change the language. It's mutter for everybody when you don't change the language. So is the second case telling me that when you change the language, then the neder falls apart? That's not unique to Rabbi Akiva. According to Rava, that's even Rabbanan would agree to that. That's what the Gemara says. The first case, you can say that the neder falls apart is because you actually made an addendum, and any addendum causes a neder to fall apart. So that explains Hutter Echem, the first case number 1. But case number 2, there's no chiddush. El Seifa, which says Seifa in this case means case number 2. The Amal is Elazar. And you say Rabbi Akiva, only Rabbi Akiva holds the neder falls apart. If you change the language, if you change the language from kulchem to zelazeh, or zelazeh to kulchem, amai pliga Rabbanan aleh. Why would Rabbanan argue on that? According to Rava, Rava holds that once you change the language, even the Rabbanan will hold that the neder falls apart. So it's not unique to Rabbi Akiva. So how do you explain that Gemara? That Mishnah, Amalei Rava, Rava will answer back, Ula Rabba. According to Rabba, Rabbi Akiva minicha seifa. does the sefer make sense? Let's take a look at the last case. According to Rabbah, you change the language. When you change the language and you add an addendum, the neder falls apart. So what's case number 3, where the neder did not fall apart, is you did not change the language. So, but then Rabbah is going to ask, but why does the Mishnah say that only if the neder fell apart to one person, only that the last person, achra means the last person is mutter, and everybody's asr. It has nothing to do with last or first. It's one of them. It falls apart for one of them. Does the neder fall apart or not fall apart? It has nothing to do with rishon or acharite. So why is the Mishnah over here specifically talking about the first one that became asr or the last one that became asr? Just one of them falling apart by one of them could cause the whole thing to break apart for everybody else. So that's what the Gemara's question is. But my Merkel the Amar Lekulchem, that the last case is talking about he remained with the same language, and that's why the neder didn't fall apart in case number 3. Heidain Rishon, Heidain Achron. Heidain Hu Achron. Why do you say that if the first one, if it fell apart for the first one or it falls apart for the last one, it just needs to fall apart for one of them? That's the whole point. So why does it say first person or last person? So the Rav is going to say that we misread the Mishnah. It's a different case totally. Ella, Reisha, the first case of the Mishnah, the way Rav is going to learn, is Dama Lekulchem. You said Kulchem, and then you added an addendum. The Mishnah, the case number 1, everything falls apart. According to Rava, all you need to do is add an addendum. The whole Rabbi Kiva holds the whole neder falls apart. According to Rabbah, the first case is you add an addendum, plus you change the language. Fine. But the sefer, the second case, and the third case of the Mishnah is Kagon Shetol and Zebazeh. You connected everyone in a chain. In other words, Va'ama, and you said, Ploini Kaplini, Uplini Kaplini. In other words, you said, you're Aser. And then you went to the second guy, you should be like this guy. And then to the third guy, you should be like the second guy. And to the fourth guy, you said, you should be like the third guy. So in that case, then it depends. If the first one became mutter, since everybody's connected to the first guy, so then everybody becomes mutter. And if the last one becomes mutter, so he's only connected to nobody else. He's only connected to the one before, but everybody else is connected to the one before them. So therefore, only the last one would be mutter and not anybody else. That's how you explain this end of this Mishnah. And that perfectly makes sense. Deikinami, and if it's precisely this way, the Tanya, we learned in the Brisa explaining the Mishnah, if the middle person became mutter, like the middle person of this chain became mutter, said Hemeru Lamata Mutarim. Those that followed him afterwards were dependent on him having the neder. So now he became mutter, everybody else below him become mutter. Ulamala asurim, but everybody else above him remains asur. So it's a totally different case, and you can't ask from that Mishnah on Rabbah or Rava's interpretation of Rabbi Kiva and the Chachamim or Beis Hillel and the B'Shamai. Let's read the next case and then we'll end. Here's a nice case in the Mishnah. Rav Ada bar Ahava asked the question according to Rava. A guy says, Botzel shani time. I'll never eat onions again. Why is he not eating onions again? Because he went to a health nutritionist, and the nutritionist told him shahabotzel ra lelev. The nutritionist told him, the nutritionist said that onions are bad for the heart. Amrulai, so they told him, Valai hakufri yafa lelev. Isn't the onions from the city of Kufri is beautiful for the heart? So he regrets because now he wants to have the kufri butts, the kufri onions. So huter b'kufri. So if we tell him that he made a heter and says, I want to exclude from my neder the kufri onions, so then everything, the whole neder falls apart. The whole neder falls apart. And Ma'aseh, there was a story like this. Rabbi Meir said, okay, now that I was mati you on the kufri onions, because now you want to eat kufri onions because you didn't know kufri onions are good for your heart. So then, capri, okay? So then everything, the whole neder falls apart. You don't have a neder on onions anymore, and that's it. It broke apart the whole neder. So my love, what was the story over there? That there was no change in language. That means he said the same thing. If I would have known that the kufri was the good for the heart, I would have kept the same language, and I would have said, all the onions are asa, the kufri mutter, and the kufri is mutter. I would have never changed my language had I known. Wait, when you don't change your language, according to Rabbah, so right away the question's on Rabbah. According to Rabbah, if you don't change your language, the neder never falls apart. Nobody agrees. So that will this part of the Mishnah is certainly a question on Rabbah. How does Rameir say that all the neder falls apart? But he would have said he was kept the same language. And even according to Rava who holds that you don't need to change the language to fall apart, but Rameir never holds. Rameir holds you go after what he said earlier. Twice lashon rishon. And if Rameir is aligned with his opinion, then you should give primacy to the fact that he said kol habitzolim asurim. All onions remain asur. And nothing should become, only the kufri should be mutter, but the neder should still remain in effect. So how does this Mishnah discuss that Rameir totally said the whole thing fell apart? Answers the Gemara, it's not so. Ba'omer, he said, if the kufri was go to the heart, I would have changed the language. I would have said, no, this type of onion is also to me, and that type of onion is also to me. I would have changed my whole language. So it's not just an addendum he would have made. I would have changed the whole language. I would have said, Batzel plenty, asurin, the kufri muta. I would have said this onion and this onion should be also to me, and the kufri should be muta. So Rameir, why did Rameir say the whole thing fall apart? According to Rabbah, since there's a change of language over here, so it's aliba de Rabbi Akiva. Only Rabbi Akiva holds the language. Once you have a change of language and you're added the addendum, only Rabbi Akiva would hold that the neder falls apart. Only like Beis Hillel, Rabbi Akiva is like Beis Hillel, that the neder falls apart. It's totally broken. Because according to Rabbah learned that even if there's a change of language, the Chachamim and Beis Shammai still disagree with that. So Rabbi Meir went with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. According to Rabbah, since there's a change of language, according to Rabbah, everybody agrees once you change the language, the whole neder falls apart. The argument is only when you're not changing the language. But if you're changing the language, even Rabbanan and Beis Shammai agree that the neder falls apart. So it could be that Rameir went even according to the opinion of Rabbanan. So we just squared away this whole Mishnah that it could be, it makes sense whether you hold like Rabbah or whether you hold like Rava. Yeah, okay. So that's the end of the learning tonight.